Oh, okay. Well, it is 5:04, and as I alluded to earlier, we have a lot of wonderful content on this call, so we are going to get started. So welcome, everyone. This is the Make Polluters Pay webinar. My name is Alan Palm. I'm the Executive Director of the Better Future Project. Most of you all know this, but for those who don't, Better Future Project, or BFP, is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to cultivating a grassroots response to the climate crisis. We support 3 different programs right now. So most notably, or most widely known, is 350 Mass, which is our statewide network of volunteers organized in nodes across the Commonwealth that comprises many of the participants in this call and leaders of this campaign. BFP also supports CREW, that is an acronym for Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, which is neighborhood level response to climate resilience. And then we've also launched the Make Polluters Pay campaign, which brings us here today. So on this webinar, you're going to hear from leaders in this campaign, experts in the subject matter, about what this campaign is about and why it's necessary right now. So there is so many things that we need to do, so much to do to make a more just, peaceful, and stable world. And one part of that struggle is accountability for the fossil fuel corporations who globally are most responsible for causing climate change. These are the largest oil companies in the world. They have reaped astronomical profits and have kept global society hooked on their supply of fossil fuels. And we have been for decades, but no more significantly than in 2023, bearing the costs of climate disasters on a daily basis and these in acute and devastating events. So these corporations must be held accountable financially to pay for the damages that their businesses have caused. And we need those resources to be able to withstand the ongoing impacts of climate change and recover from disasters. So in order to counteract the enormous influence of the fossil fuel industry, we need organized people. And so I thank you all again for being here on this call today. So we are going to hear from our lead sponsors in the state legislature about this policy, an act establishing a climate change superfund and promoting polluter responsibility that the campaign is pushing for. We're going to hear about the economic impacts of the policy, why it's different from policies like carbon pricing that might sound similar but are quite distinct. We're going to hear some legal analysis about the precedent and legality of this policy, of why the Commonwealth is empowered to do this if they so choose. And we're going to hear insights into what resilience measures and infrastructure that this policy could fund and why it's so needed. And finally, from one of the youth leaders of this campaign, providing us some moral authority to why we need to take this action, as unprecedented as it may be in this realm, but why it's so called for right now. So first, I'm going to introduce Representative Steve Owens, one of the lead sponsors of this policy. And Rep. Owens is consistently showing principled progressive leadership on this issue. And we're really grateful for his leadership and commitment to this cause. And I'll turn it over to you, Steve. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And thank you to everybody who came out this evening, out virtually, I should say. So a little bit about me. I'm Steve Owens. I'm the state representative for most of the city of Watertown and parts of West and North Cambridge. And I'm here to talk about the act establishing a climate change superfund and promoting polluter responsibility, which is a bit of a mouthful, which is why we call it the Make Polluters Pay Act. The principle of polluters pay is very simple, right? It's those who make a mess should be the ones to clean it up. I'm trying to teach my kids that. We're all trying to teach people that. The bill we've proposed is just as simple. Imposes a fee on the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in Massachusetts that would go into a climate resiliency superfund. These would be polluters like Shell Oil. Their profits doubled in 2022 to $42 billion. ExxonMobil, they reported a record $56 billion in profit that same year. And ExxonMobil, by the way, they forecasted how climate change would cause global temperatures to rise as long ago as the 1970s. So their private research predicted how burning fossil fuels would warm the planet, even as the company publicly denied that link and really continues to do so. So these companies have gotten away with polluting our air with greenhouse gases, and they know the consequences. So what this bill does is requires them, those responsible for over 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. And just for context, average American produces about 16 tons of greenhouse gases. So we're talking about a lot of greenhouse gases in a billion. It requires them to pay a fee on their share of historic emissions, and that would go to the DEP for the purposes of a climate change adaptation superfund. And we know that the superfund model for dealing with pollution works, right? Where I live in Watertown, the Watertown Arsenal is an example of a superfund success story. The EPA designated the Arsenal as a superfund site back in 1984. Cleanup activities commenced then. They removed contamination. They demolished a nuclear reactor. And now the former Arsenal is really once again an engine of growth for Watertown, for us here in town. So a climate resiliency superfund, it can really do the same thing for those areas most impacted by the devastating effects of climate change, including those in environmental justice communities, where we anticipate about 40% of this money will go. We know that storms are going to be more serious. We know about sea level rise. We know shoreline erosion, storm surges will impact our coast, rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns. They're likely to increase the intensity of flooding, of storms, of droughts even. And we're on the hook for the cost of those of climate change now. We're paying for that. This year alone, Massachusetts experienced severe flooding that caused several towns to declare local states of emergency. North Andover sustained close to 30 million in damages. When the Connecticut River flooded, about 75 farms, about 2,000 acres, severe flood damage, and just in the short term, that damage was over $10 million. Last month's flooding in Leominster caused between 25 million and 45 million in damage to the city's infrastructure. So we are paying for that. We estimate that the polluters pay could raise about $10 billion over the next 10 years to Massachusetts, which would all go to climate projects. Possible projects that would be available or eligible for this funding, things like restoring coastal wetlands, upgrading stormwater drainage, defensive upgrades to roads, bridges, transit, preparing for and recovering from hurricanes, other extreme weather, relocating or retrofitting sewage treatment plants, public health programs to address the impact of climate change, retrofitting schools, public housing, other buildings with energy efficient heating and cooling, upgrading the electrical grid. We know that if we are going to build a resilient future, we need to rely less on natural gas for electricity. That means we'll need to upgrade our grid to be able to handle that electricity and heating and cooling, and driving. Addressing our urban heat island, so with urban forestry and green spaces. So these are some of the possible things that money would be available for. And, you know, not for nothing, the oil and gas companies, they were projected to spend more than 500 billion on identifying, extracting, and producing new oil and gas supplies this year alone. So the amount we are asking them to contribute is really just a pittance compared to what they plan to spend on making the problem worse. So this is really our chance to prepare the Commonwealth for the inevitable. The bill is designed to hold those responsible for extreme weather events, hold them accountable, further allowing our cities and towns to prepare for and protect our residents against the worst that climate change has to offer us going forward. So I'm really excited about this bill. I'm really excited to work with the Better Future Project 350 and all the great, wonderful grassroots environmental groups to push this bill forward. We had a great hearing at the State House. We had a great briefing, and we're really bringing this now to the people. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing on this, and looking forward for the rest of the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rep. Owens, and thank you again for your courage and your leadership on this issue, and really highlighting that climate change is a justice issue, and it exaggerates the current injustices in our society, and that with this bill and this policy, we have a chance to counteract that, taking resources where they've been unjustly accumulated and putting them where they're mostly needed. So thank you so much for your words, and again for your consistent work to make this bill a reality. So
Thank you.
is Senator Eldridge here yet? No, not quite. So we're expecting Senator Eldridge, the lead sponsor and the state Senate on this bill, any moment. But right now, if he's ready, we'd like to turn it over to Peter Howard, the economics director of the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law, to talk about some of the economic impacts of this policy. Thank you, Peter. Welcome.
Hello. Should I share my screen? I wasn't aware. I thought somebody else was going to show the slides. But I'll do it.
Whatever you're comfortable with. I think Dan's prepared to run it for you.
Okay. Okay, so Dan could run the slides. That'd be great. Thank you. So I'll just start out. I'm the economics director at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law. A lot of this what I'm presenting today is based on a report that I wrote with respect to New York State's proposed law that's very similar. And so if you're interested, this is going to be a very short presentation, but if you're more interested in the details, you can ask me questions at the end. I'm happy to answer them, as well as there's a report online at Policy Integrity website. So next slide, please. So the bill is designed to assess compensatory payments of $3 billion annually over 25 years, which comes out to about $75 billion. And this will be put into a climate adaptation fund. It covers emissions from 2000 to 2018. And so the liable firms are firms that are sufficiently connected to the state of Massachusetts, that engaged in extraction, production, refinement, or sale of petroleum or other greenhouse gas intensive products like coal and natural gas during the covered period. And then they have to have emitted, though, 1 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents during that covered period. So not all firms apply. The liability share for each company is going to be based on their relative emissions during the covered period. So if you emit more, you pay more during over the 25 years. Next slide, please. And the key point in the analysis that I did, looking at the New York State law, is that the current design of the Climate Superfund is based on other Superfund acts, which was mentioned earlier, and therefore it's based on past emissions, not current emissions. And as a consequence, it's treated as a fixed cost of production by the firms. Because price is a function of demand and variable production of costs, changing fixed costs, which are tied to past production, will not affect the profit maximizing decisions of the firms. Furthermore, oil firms would and other firms more generally that are involved in energy wouldn't be able to retaliate against the state because of competitive pressures, but also due to antitrust law. Next slide, please. There is an issue in the long run, which is that firms could exit the industry if the payments were exorbitant. But as we heard earlier from the earlier speaker, they're really not that large relative to the overall side of the economy. And I'm going to these companies, and I'm going to show you in a future slide that it's not very large. But I want to make a couple additional points. I also want to point out that even if you did cause negative profits temporarily during 1 or 2 years, this would not actually cause firms to exit the industry. Furthermore, Massachusetts, as well as the federal government, have antitrust laws, and this would be the result of market power that the prices would increase, so it would be covered by that. And then finally, the law is not written such that if you exit the industry, you're no longer liable. So as a consequence, there is really no incentive for the rules design in order for companies to actually leave the market. And so therefore, they would be really bearing the cost of the rule. Next slide, please. And then this is just a point to show, and this is what I was mentioning earlier, is the relative size of these payments. Even if we make the extreme assumption that oil companies would pay all of the fees, which is not actually realistic. It's only somewhere between 1 to 6% of their total bottom line, but natural gas companies and coal will also be a part of that. So their profits, this is an overestimate, an upper bound on the estimate of the percentage of profits. We can also see that it's an even smaller share of revenue and about a similar share of total market capitalization. So this is really, the Massachusetts rule really shouldn't impact the ability of these firms to make a profit. Next slide, and my last slide, please. And then my final point I wanted to make is, there is an issue with expectations, so that this rule could impact how firms expect the rule to occur in the future, and if future rules will occur. But actually, we should expect that to happen. And so if a firm expects future liability, then maybe they would tie that to their current production. However, actually, we should probably expect the opposite, as currently, due to climate pledges and policies, these firms are really expecting to be held liable. And the reason is because there is actually a growth in liability lawsuits that already exist, as well as an international recognition of the connection between climate impacts and human rights. And finally, many of these energy companies actually already have an internal price of carbon in order to actually factor in their liability risks. So they're already accounting for this. And then the last point I would like to make, and just a real quick point, is that remember also that this is going to an adaptation fund, and climate change is occurring, and it's not going to only impact residents, but it'll also impact the energy infrastructure. And as a consequence, if we this will actually potentially lower energy prices to the extent that it's used to actually help the energy industry and infrastructure of Massachusetts adapt. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that explanation, those details, and that important context. We know that the fossil fuel industry has been effective at evading responsibility for decades. And one of the tactics that they try and confuse us with is by making us think that that consumers are going to pay the cost of any accountability measures. So thank you for showing us and demonstrating that they can more than afford it. And we all know that if they don't pay the cost, that we will. And in fact, we already are, and certainly future generations will, as well as populations of people around the world. So this is a small price for them, but it is something that we need to hold them accountable for. So thank you so much for your work and for being here tonight. And here we have Senator Eldridge. Thank you so much for joining us, our lead sponsor in the state Senate. Again, a consistent and principled warrior for progressive values in the State House. We're honored to have your leadership on this policy, and thanks for being here tonight. I'll please take it away. So, Representative Owens kind of gave us some background and introduction on the bill, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on this policy as well, and why you've chosen to take it on.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. Sorry for coming in a bit late, but did get to hear Peter's lifting up some of the issues. And yeah, very, very proud to file this with Representative Owens. We've had some really great events with 350 Mass and Better Future Project. And, you know, I think what I would say is that, you know, since Representative Owens and I have filed a bill in Massachusetts, just like many states, there have just been some real weather extremes. So, you know, there's been a lot of heat extremes over the summer, been some really noticeable flooding incidents, whether in Boston, Worcester, Leominster, different parts of Massachusetts, Western Mass. And I think that has finally woken up a lot of people in the middle to the fact that, you know, we're already seeing these impacts, and how do we make our communities more climate resilient? And despite the fact that the legislature and governors, whether our current governor or our last governor, you know, have passed comprehensive climate action legislation, you know, committing the state to reducing our carbon emissions, in none of those laws did we actually create a dedicated revenue source that would speak to, you know, making our communities more climate resilient, whether it's, you know, more shelters from heat waves, to supporting, you know, farms that might get flooded more, to our downtowns that, you know, can easily get flooded with these intense rains. So obviously the Make Polluters Pay bill, an act establishing a climate change super fund and promoting polluter responsibility, would create that dedicated revenue source. And as has already been mentioned, would be paid for by the very companies that are responsible for climate change and global warming. So, this is a dedicated revenue source that I think that, sort of crosses, as far as recognizing the need for more investment, crosses partisan line, where legislators at the State House, whether Republican or Democrat, are really seeing the impact on their communities, and they want to see, a dedicated revenue source for this. Not to mention, investing more in solar, and offshore wind, energy efficiency, and making sure we meet our climate goals, whether the enact for 2050 roadmap law or the Drive Act, which the legislature passed last year. So this legislation would address both points. Obviously, I know this is national, legislation, so I'm very proud to be part of a bill that, is also being proposed at the federal level. And I would say right now in the legislature, the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utility, and Energy, which Representative Owens and I, had the chance to testify before. A lot of questions were asked. This is a very obviously different approach, a new idea, but it is not clear what the climate change legislation is going to look like that the legislature will pass this session. So, I think that's where this could fit in. Governor Healy, to her credit, has created a community climate bank. And that's the idea of making sure that our housing, particularly affordable housing, is resilient and energy efficient. And so, that again is speaking to, I would say, the other major crisis that the state is facing besides climate is the housing crisis. And so if this source of funding is a way to make sure that as we're building housing, all types of housing, that it's energy efficient, that it's 100% electric, I think that, will be very helpful as well. And then, of course, there's the continued conversations and push around transportation, whether it's seeing more EVs on the road, whether it's electrifying our rail system and reducing, an emitter of about 30% of emissions in Massachusetts is transportation. So I think this bill fits very well to address those problems in Massachusetts. And it's been great to work with our partners on putting forth this legislation and gathering support for it. So thanks for having me on, and glad to be part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Senator Eldridge. And as you alluded to, that this is it crosses political ideologies. We did some polling related to the question of should the fossil fuel industry be held accountable financially for climate damages? And it polls over 80% in most places in Massachusetts. So it's a very popular issue. The people demand it. And as you referred to, it is necessary to bring in sources of revenue to pay for the infrastructure changes that we need across all sectors and to be more resilient in the face of climate change. So thank you again for your leadership. We hope that the governor will also take this up and to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable in the way that she did it as Attorney General. So thank you so much for introducing this policy. And next we have one of our volunteer leaders here at 350 Mass, Paul Shorb, to speak to the legal questions that folks will come up with around this policy. Does the state have the power to do it? Will the fossil fuel industry fight it? Paul does a lot for 350 Mass, involved in many different campaigns, and in his other life or former life was involved in some Superfund related lawsuits as well. So I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks everybody for showing up. I should give a shout out when I start here to Rachel Rothschild. She's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan Law School, where I graduated from 1,000 years ago. She's sick, so I'm filling in. But I have read her written work. I've talked to her about it. And as Alan said, I spent 40 years working on the prior bill. This has inspired this bill to some extent. So it's obviously relevant to us as activists to consider if this passed, would the courts just throw it out? Because if yes, then why would we bother? The bottom line, in my opinion, is, of course, the fossil fuel companies that are targeted by this will challenge it, just like companies challenged the original Superfund law back when I was starting out in my practice. But I think the odds are very good this legislation will survive those challenges, just as the original Superfund did. So we should press ahead and try to enact this thing. So I'll just tackle 3 questions that might be on the mind of some thinking people. One is it really okay to charge fossil fuel companies now for what they did 20 years in a 20-year period before the bill was passed? Well, the answer is clearly yes. It's not a criminal penalty. You can't make those retroactive, but you can make this kind of thing retroactive. That's exactly how the original Superfund law works. The way that one worked, if you arrange for the disposal of hazardous substances at a landfill or recycling facility, but then start to leak or catch on fire and presents public danger, then original Superfund says you can be forced to help pay for cleanup, even if it was perfectly legal when you sent the stuff. So similar logic applies here. Second question. Most of these fossil fuel companies don't do their extraction or refining inside the state of Massachusetts. So can we really get them for those acts? It's clear that we can, at least for companies that do business in Massachusetts. For example, if they sell their products at gas stations or otherwise, that's clearly enough. There's a million court cases on this. Well, what about companies that don't do anything directly in Mass, like Aramco in Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest fossil producers in the world? Not less certain, but there is precedent to suggest that we may be able to enforce the law against them as well, based, for example, on the fact that they knew that greenhouse gas emissions would raise temperatures globally and therefore affect Massachusetts. So if we can't get Aramco, for example, well, this bill has a neat trick built into it, where it says that if a fossil fuel company doesn't have legally sufficient connections with Mass, then it doesn't count as a company to be targeted. So that means the other companies pick up the share. So we don't have a so-called orphan share in theory. So last question. Since it's a national and international issue, can one state really take a bite out of it? Is that really legal? There is something in the U.S. Constitution called the Commerce Clause and the so-called Dormant Commerce Clause. And there are a lot of cases on this. So they do put some guardrails on it, but I think this kind of law can stay within those guardrails and thereby survive. The key point would be to show that 75 billion or whatever number is right-sized to the amount we will need to spend or the pain we will incur due to climate change. I'm sure we can come up with that kind of that basis, in which case I think this is strong against anticipated legal challenges. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul, for kind of answering those questions that come up a lot. We know, obviously, the fossil fuel industry is going to fight back against this in court. That is not at all a reason to be deterred. We are here to fight the fossil fuel industry, and we're here to fight them in many different fronts, and including in court. And what Paul has just explained is so this bill or companion versions of this have been introduced in the state legislatures in New York, Vermont, and Maryland. And the Attorney General's Office of Maryland recently produced a written document explaining that the state did in fact have the legal authority to claim those funds, the constitutional authority to claim the financial accountability from these companies. So yeah, that is not a reason for an excuse for why we shouldn't take action on this bill, because we do have the legal precedent to go forward with this, and we do have a good chance at winning. So thank you, Paul, for those insights. So next we have Rose Abramoff, a climate scientist and a PhD in ecology and a current research scholar at the Ronin Institute, who will talk to us about some of the things that we could do with those funds, some of the changes that we could make to our neighborhoods, to our infrastructure, to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Welcome, Rose.
Thanks, Alan. Paul, are you going to share my
I think Dan will.
Okay. Okay. So under the MPP bill, the money that is collected can be used for basically anything that would help either prepare for, avoid, reduce, or respond to the harms of climate change. So I'm just going to give some examples in this short presentation. And I think it's important to note here that 40% of MPP funds are earmarked to benefit environmental justice populations. And what those are basically communities, lower income people, minority groups that tend to be hardest hit by the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, so extreme heat events are becoming more frequent. I think we already heard several people comment on the summer that we just had. And, as we know, there are lots of vulnerable populations, especially older people. So these funds can be spent, for example, to provide energy efficient air conditioning or cooling facilities for, public and private buildings to keep people safe during extreme heat events. Next slide. Medical care. So as New England gets warmer, new diseases that we're not used to are likelier to move north. One example is, I think people remember the Zika virus going from South America to Florida. So we may see those types of illnesses move even further north. We actually do expect that. And so funds such as these can be used for preventative care and for medical care, in the case of such outbreaks. Next. Just blowing through these. So global warming brings not only drought, but we can also have more intense rainfall events, stronger storms because of warmer ocean temperatures and flooding. And in places where stormwater and sewage collection systems are combined, this can often overwhelm, like intense rainfall events or storms can overwhelm local sewage treatment plants, which sends untreated sewage into and thereby contaminating local waterways. So we can also use these funds to basically help protect our water treatment systems. Next. All right, so I mentioned intense storms. They also, I'm sure we've experienced in our recent memory, knocking down trees and power lines. And these funds can be used to, bury power lines, make power lines more resilient or make repairs when they are damaged. So the next thing we can do is restore floodplains to help mitigate flooding. This can help slow down and store floodwaters, and also to minimize and repair damage that is inevitably caused by flooding. And another way to protect against flooding, next slide, is by restoring coastal wetlands. So this is usually done by removing man-made infrastructure and essentially returning this land to nature, planting native plants. And by restoring these types of lands and providing that permeable surface, you can see in this marshy area right here how it can help protect people's homes, right? It serves as a buffer to the nearby waterway. Next slide, please. So these types of coastal wetlands don't just provide a flood mitigation, they also have a lot of co-benefits. So they can remove contaminants from water, they support local biodiversity and wildlife, and they provide a lot of educational opportunities, recreation, tourism, and jobs. Another potential infrastructure improvement, next slide, is waterfront perks. So as ocean storm surges get bigger and sea levels rise, the name of the game essentially is trying to increase pervious surfaces, surfaces that are permeable and have plants and soil on them, which can basically absorb water. So one example of that type of green infrastructure is floodwater parks, but there are also other things like floodwater retention basins, and just expanding like different types of permeable surface materials in our cities. So this is an example of a waterfront park in New Jersey. And you can see how, it would be fairly impermeable to flooding. I think I've got another nice picture of a waterfront park in South Korea on the next slide. And it's also one of those things that has a co-benefit in that, it makes cities more beautiful and more walkable and provides recreation for people, encourages people to use public transportation to walk around their city. So next slide. Sort of related to that is greening, urban greening. So the MPP bill specifically mentions addressing urban heat islands through green spaces and urban forestry. And so planting trees can be super helpful for climate mitigation, especially urban heat islands, because when leaves, release water through the little pores in their leaves called stomates, it actually literally cools the surrounding air and it lowers maximum daily temperatures. And so it makes it more bearable to be outdoors in the summer. It's not just, like shade blocks the sun, but trees also literally lower the temperature through this process of transpiration, evaporation through their leaves. And trees near buildings can actually lower AC bills, air conditioning bills by about 30%, and winter heating bills by a similar percentage range. And as with restoring coastal wetlands, greening the cities can bring a lot of co-benefits. The most obvious one to me is that plants absorb carbon dioxide, which directly mitigates global warming. And then next slide. There are a lot of ways to green cities. You don't just need to plant urban trees along the street sides. You can green up building surfaces like walls and roofs. So green roofs can also have similar cooling effects compared to typical roofs and absorb water. And you can also use these to grow food. They can promote biodiversity, support pollinators, and urban gardens can grow food. In the next slide, I think I have another nice picture of an urban garden that's at ground level. And that can also mitigate, food deserts and the sort of relative lack of healthy of people's access to healthy vegetables in parts of the city. And in the last slide, I think I just have some nice pictures of trees. I'll just close by saying, by having a sort of vision for future cities that explicitly works with nature rather than against it, we can not only directly mitigate against climate change, which is sort of the crux of the main point of the MPP bill, right? But also protect ourselves from climate risks and benefit from these healthier and better infrastructures and services. So yeah, that's my bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. As someone who's familiar with the bill, I learned a lot by listening to your presentation. I found that your explanation of the examples of different co-benefits was really inspiring to think about how a response to climate change can really center improving our health, improving our ecosystems in ways that will improve our society, our economies, our connections with one another. So thank you for that. And it makes me think about the co-benefits too of being able to engage people in an organizing effort to pass a bill like this, but also to hear from different stakeholders about what they need for their communities to stay safe and resilient in the face of climate change. So as we've heard about what this bill is, why it's called for, what the impacts will be, both economically, the legal justification, what we could do with it in regard to infrastructure, we need to also think about the action, the organizing, the grassroots power that we need to generate in order to win a policy like this in the face of the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And so to help us and start thinking about that, we're going to welcome Sebastian Lemberger, who is a leader in the Massachusetts climate movement. He's also a junior at Phillips Exeter Academy. He's active in the Massachusetts Youth Climate Coalition and the nationally focused group Our Climate. So Sebastian, thank you so much for your ongoing leadership on this policy in the climate movement and for being here with us on this call today.
All right. Hello, I'm Sebastian. Like Ellen said, I'm a junior in high school at Phillips Academy, Andover. I've been working on the Make Polluters Pay campaign as a representative for Our Climate and the Massachusetts Youth Climate Coalition since around the start of this year's legislative session. I think that of all the people on this panel, I'm probably the least qualified person here to talk about the bill, as I've never really had any formal training on law or politics. However, I don't believe that my sort of lack of experience in relation to these fields is relevant to why I'm here, because I'm here due to the fact that I care very deeply about what this bill does and what it symbolizes, which is fighting the fossil fuel industry. We will never solve climate change until we bring an end to fossil fuel extraction. And the greatest weapon in our hands to do this is policy. A bill like the Polluters Pay Superfund bill, as other presenters have pointed out, sets a powerful precedent for aggressive legislation that takes steps to both protect people from the climate crisis and also attack the source of the problem. I'm sure you have all heard this point a million times, but my hope is that hearing it repeated again by someone who isn't traditionally a guest on panels like this drives you towards taking action. Because I think that my presence here illustrates an important point that I hope that all of you can take away from this webinar. And that point is to create a safer and cleaner Commonwealth. Everyone here has to do their part, from high schoolers to retired people. Everyone has to go and take action, otherwise nothing is going to happen. Because the fossil fuel industry is very deeply ingrained into our way of life. So the only way to really get rid of it is if everyone makes a conscious effort to end it. We're all needed in this struggle, and every single person on this webinar has a part to play in passing the Make Polluters Pay bill through the state legislature. I hope that after hearing from all of our wonderful panelists, you can see that the $75 billion in climate adaptation funds that would come out of this bill are really within reach, so long as we work together to pass it. So to this end, I'm not going to go on for much longer about this, and we're going to end the webinar with an action item that we hope will preclude future involvement for all of you. If you check the chat, I believe Dan at any moment now saying both a toolkit for our action item, as well as a list of take-home actions that I hope all of you will do at some point when you leave the call. So as to what our action item for today will be, the Make Polluters Pay bill is currently in a point in the legislature where we need to move it out of committee because it's currently sitting in the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. And you all today are going to help us do that by placing calls to your legislators and telling them to do what they can to move this bill out of committee. So if you look in the chat and click on the toolkit, which is the link that Dan has posted, you'll see the toolkit. Towards the top of the toolkit, there will be a link that should say you can find your legislator here or something like that. It will take you to find my legislator. If you don't already know who that is, you can find it there. Below it are a list of every legislator in the Environmental and Natural Resources Committee, along with their phone numbers and emails, as well as every legislator in House and Senate leadership, or in key roles in House and Senate leadership, as well as their emails and phone numbers. There is a corresponding script for each type of legislator. There are 3 types of calls that we'll be making today. We'll be making calls to critical legislators within the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. You'll find a script for that linked in the table of contents of the toolkit. You'll be making calls to House and Senate leadership. And if your local legislator isn't under either of those demographics, you'll just be calling them and telling them to talk to your colleagues. So we're going to take like 10-ish minutes to do this. If you all want to like mute and turn off your cameras to do this, please do. Additionally, once you've made a call, please, or while you're in process of making a call, please put in the chat who you're calling so we know, and we can also have that nice experience of like seeing some sort of tangible manifestation of the action that everyone's taking right now. So I'm gonna stop talking now. Let's get calling.
All right, folks, let's come back together. Wrap your calls as you're able. Give you a couple more seconds to do so. And make sure you post in the chat who you called. Seeing some great stuff here. We have Bob called Senator Mike Rush. Got some calls to Rep. Gentile, Rep. Donato, Michael called Senator Eldridge. I think we're pretty good on that one, but always good to keep calling. Bob Wald called Tram Nguyen.
So he can tell the leadership he's getting a lot of calls.
Exactly, exactly. All right. And so this campaign is fundamentally about standing up to corporate power. And the only way we can do that is with people power. And that means all of you. And so I'm so grateful for everyone on this call, for everyone who RSVP'd, everyone who came to our forum in Watertown this afternoon, and everyone who's taking action with us this summer and moving forward. We have started to build a really damn strong campaign. We had a fantastic launch and hearing and briefing in the spring. We've had around 30 tabling and public-facing events in the summer and fall. And as we move into the winter, we're really going to be pressing hard on legislative contact, municipal resolutions in support of the bill, and our petition targeting Governor Healy. If any of that excites you, if none of it excites you, but you still feel passionately, if you have any desire at all to get involved, stay tuned. We'll be reaching out to you, and we need you in this campaign. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I and some of the other panelists will be staying on to answer any questions that folks might have, but unfortunately we are out of time for a more formal Q&A session. But if you have any questions, anything pressing, feel free to stay on. I'll be on for quite some time, and we would love to hear from you. Everyone else, thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Paul and Sebastian, for leading the organizing of this. Thank you, Alan, for being our fantastic MC. Thank you, Rose, for coming out. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Senator Eldridge and Representative Owens, and all of you for being here. Thank you so much and have a great night.